Hello and what is up? It's your boy Real_Joshua, and today we will be answering the ever important question of just what the hell do I swing at in the One Piece card game. First off, thank you to everyone who watches these videos and supports the channel. If you have not yet done so, I highly welcome you to subscribe and like the video and the channel. It's really helpful. Now, if you have not seen the first two videos in this series, I highly encourage that you do so, as the stuff that we learn in those videos is going to be crucial for understanding this stuff in this video. In fact, I wanted to make this video earlier, except I realized I needed to describe a few more concepts before I did that, and that's where those other two videos came from. In this video, we're going to be talking about what to swing at in the game of One Piece. For those who don't know, swinging is just when you attack with either your leader or one of your characters. In the first video, we talked about how swinging allows you to pressure everything from your opponent's board by swinging at their board, their life by swinging at their leader, to their hand by swinging at things that they would like to protect. Now, when figuring out what we want to swing at, there are actually quite a few things that we need to keep in mind in any given time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to describe a few kind of different spectrums and things that you should be thinking about. And this will help us to determine what the best thing to swing at is at any given moment in the game. It's not always going to be perfect, and a lot of the times there are going to be conflicting ideas of what we should be swinging at, but it's up to you to make the best decision in those cases. And I hope that I give you a framework for understanding what you should be swinging at and why. The first thing I want to talk about is an overarching rule that I use that, when you think about everything else in this video, all the other questions, they should all lead up to this one even bigger question, which is what puts the maximum amount of pressure on my opponent? The first thing I want to discuss is the most generalized way of thinking about this, right? And this has to do with video number 2, which is what kind of deck are we, right? Are we an aggro deck? Are we a mid-range deck? Or are we a control deck? This is a spectrum. The good thing is the spectrum here actually gives us a pretty simple prescription of what we should be swinging at just by understanding what our deck does, right? So if we are an aggro deck, generally, we want to be swinging more at life, okay? If we are a mid-range deck, that's actually when it's the most difficult. When we are a mid-range deck, we need to kind of ask this question every single turn. We have to do that with every deck, but the most so with the mid-range deck. We're playing for the maximum value at all times. We need to know when to be aggressive and when to be more control-y with a mid-range deck. Finally, we have the control decks. With control, we are generally going to be wanting to swing more at the board and not caring as much about swinging at life, because with a control deck, we want to starve our opponent of resources, and then once their hand is empty and once they have pretty much nothing else left to do, then it's easier for us to start swinging at our life. Not that we cannot swing at their life before that, it's just that generally we want to starve them out before we start swinging at them. Okay, these are very, very general, and we will be talking about all the intricacies of these very, very soon. But first, let's start with aggro. Why do we want to swing more at the opponent's life with aggro decks? Well, first off, if you take stuff like the fast wide decks that we discuss, like stuff like Zoro, Red, Green, Law, Bello Betty, for instance, these are decks that use a lot of smaller bodies and use those to swing at the opponent en masse in one kind of big push forward, right? What is beneficial about swinging at the opponent's life with these decks is that it requires the opponents to invest more back into the bodies than we have to initially exert to get the damage on the opponent. So for instance, if you take a deck like Bello Betty, you have all these weenies, all these, 1k, 2k power creatures on the board, same with Zoro, for instance, that we are pumping up and we swing with them. And then on the opponent's turn, they have a board full of rested characters on our side of the board, but these are like 2k, 3k power creatures that they are being forced to swing at. That means that they are using their turn just to deal with the threat on the board. So we just need to keep that threat coming, and then we should be able to push past what they are doing. On top of that, it buys us defense, right? Because when our opponent is swinging at our board and trying to handle our board, they're not swinging at us. This could be a little bit difficult because if we waste all of the cards in our hand, we are not getting these cards out of our own life to kind of replenish our resources. But that's just why we need to kind of keep our value engines going as these decks, or push the opponent down to a point where we can get them within striking distance of lethal, so that we can then use our like finishers, our, you know, kidding killers, our Monkey D dragons to finish off the game with one last push. I am not going to talk that much about mid-range decks because this is going to be kind of the majority of what I talk about in this video, is the nuance of what we want to be swinging at, right? So I will get to that a bit later, right? For control, like I said, we generally want to swing more at the board. Think about Enel, for instance, right? Enel has a lot of characters. If you take, for instance, Gedatsu, that is a card that gets stronger and can take out more opponent characters the higher life your opponent is at. So a lot of Enels will just try to starve the opponent, or at least keep them at relatively high life so that they could take out a bigger character using Gedatsu. The whole point of Enel is that you keep replenishing your life, you stay out of lethal range so that you can just use your triggers and your leader ability to outlast the opponent, and you're never going to kind of run out of cards because you're never going to be at risk of really dying, and you could just focus instead on getting the most value out of every single card. When this is the case, you know, you never really need to swing at the opponent's life until, you know, you have a board full of 10 cost aces, Yamatos, Katakuris. That's why stuff like Katakuri will actually put life into the opponent's life, because you are not really trying to race them down to 0 life. You're trying to outlast them. You want to be at a point where your board is full of big stuff, their board is empty, and they've run out of firepower. So a lot of your control decks are going to behave this way. Let's go back and talk about the nuances of what we should be swinging at and why. I'm going to give reasons why we should be swinging face, reasons why we should be swinging board, and then reasons why we maybe will not want to swing in certain instances. First, let's talk about reasons why we would want to swing face. One of the reasons, as we discussed earlier, is we are an aggro deck and we're trying to end the game as quickly as possible. Let's swing face. I would say if you're playing Doflamingo, we generally want to be swinging face. One other instance in which I would say we always want to swing face, this is like an easy, always swing face no matter what kind of deck you are. And I think everyone will agree with me on this, is if we are going to die next turn, we should always swing face, okay? If we look at the board and we say, with this board, we are always going to die next turn. I do not have enough counter. My opponent is always going to swing at my leader. I don't have any blockers. I don't have any life. They have 3 swings. I have 3k counter in hand. I'm always dead next turn. Then we got to push for lethal ourselves. If we cannot set up a way to save ourselves this turn, that is. Obviously, most of the time we're not going to get there, but sometimes there's a chance. Sometimes the opponent just is not going to have the counter in hand to deal with it. And in that case, we should always swing face. Another situation is, let's say that we know the opponent has something in hand that is capable of clearing our board, right? This has happened to me way too many times where it's like, I know the opponent has a jack in hand because they drew it from a Rebecca, and I have 1 4-cost boa blocker on the board, right? There are some situations people will say, well, I don't want to swing with my boa because then I put it in jeopardy of getting swung at and getting killed in battle on the next turn. Well, I know they have a jack in hand. I know they could essentially kill it for free next turn. It's always going to die. We should always swing with it, especially if we know the opponent has a way of dealing with our board on the next turn. If you're playing against black, for instance, or something like that, we should pretty much always be just swinging. Another reason why we'd want to swing face is if our rested characters exceed the opponent's attackers. So again, let's say that we're playing a deck like RG Law or something like that, and we have like 5 characters or 4 characters on board and they have 1 on board. In this case, for our opponent to deal with our board, yeah, they'll be able to get 2 swings, 1 from their leader and 1 from the character that they have on board. But in order to do that, they would have to swing with those characters, and those would be dedicated towards swinging at our board and not swinging at our face. So it's good for us because it's good for our defense, and it's good for us because they can never really clear our board using attacks. And it's also good for us because we could just kind of counter out of those because we know they only have 2 attacks coming at our board. So if we want to protect our stuff, we always have kind of an opportunity to do that. One other really potent reason why we should swing face is when they cannot afford to take life. We're going to talk about life in just a second, but I would say when the opponent gets to around 2 life or 1 life, they get to a point where they cannot just take free damage, right? Like they need to be countering out of attacks. When they reach this point, that's when we really want to start swinging at their life, because they are forced to just dump value out of their hand to the point where it makes it easier for them to lose the game because they're getting rid of cards that they really need just to survive. One other reason to swing face is to activate our leader ability if it's when attacking. You know, sometimes if we're playing Lucci or if we're playing Sanji or something, we have a when attacking effect that only triggers when we attack. So sometimes you just got to swing at whatever's available to you. Okay, now let's talk about some reasons why we might want to swing board. One reason why we might want to swing board is if we are a control deck and we know that we win the long game. So if we are against something like a Zoro, we kind of get the impression that if we deal with their board now and we can just stave them off for a little bit, they will kind of run out of steam, right? Like they can kind of only do so much, to the point where we'll reach a tipping point in the game where we just straight out value them. Another reason to swing board is if we know that our game plan hinges on board control, right? Like if I'm playing as Boa, I know that I need to keep the board as clear as possible or else I'm going to get overrun. So I should take care of their board and I should swing at their board because it's not a race. I'm a control deck. I should swing at their board. Another reason why we should swing at their board, and this can apply to any deck, is when we have sub 5k attackers versus sub 5k attackers. So one classic example of this is if your opponent is like a Jewelry Bonnie and they rest their baby 5, or you know, one of their searchers, their Jewelry Bonnie searcher, we want to be attacking their searchers because we don't want that to get continued value. So if we ourselves have a searcher on the board, let's say they have no Dawn up because they've used that to search, then in that case, it's helpful for us to use our 2k versus their 1k so that we can get that value and we can also get our own swing with our leader toward their leader. Yeah, that's what these searchers are here for, so that they can battle with other searchers. Every body on the board is a potential swing, and sometimes those swings can win or lose you the game. So you got to be careful with those. If you have a rested sub 5k character on board, you should almost always be swinging in that with one of your sub 5k characters as well. One other reason to swing board, and this is maybe the most important reason to swing board, is when there is a high threat target that you cannot handle using an effect. So let's say your opponent has a 3-cost Brook on the board, and let's say that this 3-cost Brook is rested. To many decks, a 3-cost Brook on the board represents an existential threat. Like this is a card that could screw you over if it stays there for long enough. The nice thing is, since it's a 4k character, it kind of dies pretty easily. So the problem is sometimes you don't have an effect that can get rid of that 3-cost Brook. If you're playing Doflamingo, maybe you don't have a Law Bouncer or a Jozu Bouncer to bounce that Brook back to hand. Generally, it's better for us to swing at that because the longer that stays there, the more of a threat that poses to our own board. So if that thing is rested, I highly suggest that you swing at it, especially if you don't have the means to bounce it or get rid of it some other way. This applies to any sort of threat on the board that will continue to screw you over because it has like a powerful activate main effect or something like that. One other big reason why we should be swinging board is when we want to whittle down the opponent's hand when we have no life pressure on them, okay? This is something we talked about in the first video, but swinging at opponents' characters is a really good way to put pressure on their hand. Let's take this example, okay? Your opponent is at 4 life and they have a rested blocker on the board. Let's say it is this Basil Hawkins, 7 cost, 7k. Let's say they have 8 cards in hand, right? Let's say that we have 2 Dawn up and we can either swing 7k at their leader or we could swing 7k at their rested Basil Hawkins. Which one is more likely, do you think, to get a counter out of their hand? Well, I'll pretty much let you know it's always going to be swinging at Basil Hawkins. Why is that, we ask? Well, Bonnies do not typically care about taking life damage, especially early on in the game, because they have so many blockers that can protect their life that they're never really going to be in jeopardy of life, especially if you're playing a more control-oriented type of deck. So if you swing 7k at their life, they're just going to take it. They're not going to dedicate the cards in their hand toward countering out of it. They're going to rely on their blockers to do that job for them later on in the game when they care more about that. However, if you were to attach those two Dawn, which, they're kind of just floating in this case, if you just attach those to your leader and swung at their Basil Hawkins, you would get a counter out of their hand. Let's say that you were to swing 9k at that Basil Hawkins, you would very likely get 2 cards out of their hand. If not, they just have to let their Basil Hawkins go, and that's pretty good for you. So just remember that when there is a choice between swinging at an opponent's face and swinging at an opponent's character, if your goal is to get cards out of their hand and you're against a deck like a Bonnie that really wants to go late game and they don't care about taking life damage, a lot of decks don't care about taking those first 3 life damage, you will get more value by swinging at their characters. Okay, let's talk about the last consideration. Let's talk about reasons why we would not want to swing, period. One reason why we may not want to swing is an enemy trigger would be debilitating to us. Okay, yellow deck, it could be against a blue deck, it could be against a red deck, even like a Revolutionary Army deck. They have a lot of cards that come out from their life. So if we're in a situation where we are getting aggressed on and we are barely holding back the tide of the opponent's onslaught, we may want to reconsider whether we swing at their life or not, because we realize that, okay, actually, if I attack here, it could be very, very bad for me. They could bring out a Kiku Nojo, they could bring out Lindbergh, they could bring out a Charlotte Cracker that could screw us over the next turn. It's on you to learn the matchups and what the big threat triggers are. But again, we should think about whether we want to swing before we do this. Another reason why we may not want to swing is because the opponent is on the ropes. They have like no resources in hand, and they're at a point where if we swing at them right now, we're just giving them another resource. So let's take this late game scenario, okay? Let's say I have successfully starved my opponent out of most of their resources, and I've swung 2 times with my characters and they've countered out of 2 of them. They have 1 card in hand and 4 life. If I swing with a 7k and a 9k, I'm essentially just giving them 2 cards here. Maybe it's okay for me to give them 1 card, but is it necessary for me to give them 2 in this situation? I, for instance, have at least 4 to 5 attackers on the next turn, and it's much easier for me to end this game in this scenario if I just swing with all those on the next turn, because they only have 1 more card. Maybe I won't be able to finish the game, but it'll be pretty simple for me to make one last push. And as I swing next turn, since I have so many more eligible swingers on the board, the opponent will be forced to use the cards that they get from their life to counter. So this turn, since it's the end of my push, I will not be able to push for lethal. I'll just be giving them a couple more cards that could be played to get them back into the game. Whereas next turn, if I make this push with more resources, more swings available on the board, then I will put a lot more pressure on the opponent and they will be forced to respond right then and there, wasting their resources just to stay alive if they even can. They probably won't, because I'll have so many eligible swings that I will just be able to knock them out of the game right then and there. I guess that is kind of 2 reasons. One is the enemy hand is small, and then the other one is I can win the game on the next turn if I don't swing right now. One other really big reason why we might not want to swing is because we do not want to make our board vulnerable. We have to remember that when we swing with a character, that character is rested and it could then be swung at in return. So if we are in a situation, let's say that we are playing as a Nell and we have a bunch of cards in hand. Let's say I have 2 Katakuris on board and the opponent has 1 Boa Hancock on board. They use the Boa Hancock to freeze one of my Katakuris. So on the following turn, I then have 1 Katakuri to swing with. Maybe I don't want to swing with this Katakuri because my other Katakuri can attack, and then on the following turn, the opponent will just be able to swing at my Katakuri. And for me, as an Enel, it's very important for me to stick my characters on the board because that's the only way that I can win this game is by having these attackers on the board. If I just give my opponent a free Katakuri by putting it sideways and allowing them to swing at it with their Boa Hancock, it makes my board and my win condition very, very precarious. In a situation where I don't need it to be, So maybe in this situation, I just don't swing with the Katakuri. One of the main things that we want to be considering also when we are swinging and figuring out what to swing at is the life state of the game. I consider there to be kind of two main life states in the One Piece card game. Everyone has their own way of thinking about it, but the more I've played, the more I kind of think of it in, these terms, which is we have the high life state, which is 2 or more life. And then we have the low life or, kind of danger zone, which is 2 life or less. When we are swinging, we want to take into consideration the life and health of our opponent. When they are at 3 life or above, in these situations, attacking at the opponent leader is going to be worse. That's because we're not really creating very much pressure by swinging at the opponent's leader. So this is going to be early on the game, maybe turn 2 when we can first attack, we swing 5k at the opponent's leader. They usually take that, right? If we swing 7k, they usually take that. If it's like a 4 life leader that really wants to play a control style game, maybe they'll counter out of that first one. But generally in the early game, when the opponent is at 3 life or more, swinging at their life is not going to generate that much pressure. We don't have any board presence. There is no danger that the opponent is in. As long as they can counter out of 1 or 2 of these swings at face, they're going to be fine. And on top of that, it gives the opponent cards in hand. It gives them potential triggers. It gives them more counter. It gives them cards that they could play. Maybe if I'm swinging at a Doflamingo on turn 2, I give them a Jinbei that they could then play, making my life harder. So it's just important to remember that when they are at high life, when we swing at their life, we're not actually creating that much pain or that much pressure. Now, this all changes when the opponent is at 2 life or less in the danger zone, as I like to call it. When the opponent is at 2 life or less, if we have a bunch of 5k attacks on board, these are going to create a tremendous amount of pressure because if they take 2 of these, they're at 0 and they're fighting for their life. So they have to start countering out of these attacks. That's why if we have a board full of eligible swings at the opponent, they're going to have to counter out of these. So we're just going to be creating a tremendous amount of pressure by swinging at their face. In these situations, attacking at the opponent's board is going to be weaker because there's almost less pressure on them to protect their board as there is to protect their face. See what I'm saying? Now that we've talked about all of these principles, let's take this for an example, okay? Let's say I'm in a Doflamingo mirror and my opponent has 2 life and they have a rested Edward Weevil on the board and their face is totally undefended. Besides that, they have like 3 or 4 cards in hand. Now, I could swing at the Weevil here for 6k, or I could swing at their face for 6k. We're not in any danger of dying on the next turn. In this situation, is it best for us to swing at the Weevil or at face? It could be easy to say the Weevil here, right? Because we want to play the longer game in this situation. And by swinging at the Weevil, we are fighting more for board control, which is what's important to us right now. Well, we also have to remember that we're not actually creating the most amount of pressure by swinging at the Weevil. Because the opponent has 2 life, they are highly incentivized to swing out of every single attack that comes in their face because they can only withstand 2 of those before they have no life left and they are basically dead because we could have a Perfume Femur and take them out immediately. So they're going to do everything they can to defend their face. If I swing for 6k at an Edward Weevil, all they need to do is use a 1k counter to counter out of that because it's a 6k body. Now, if I swing at their face, they are just as incentivized to counter out of that because they don't just want to be taking every swing that I send their way. The difference between 1 life and 2 life is hugely different. And if they take this damage right now, their odds of losing the game on the next turn skyrocket. So they really want to swing counter out of that, but they need a 2k to counter out of it in this case. I've seen some people say, well, isn't that just 1 card anyway? Like if they counter out of my swing at their Edward Weevil, that's only 1 card out of hand. And if I swing at their face, it's only 1 card out of hand anyway. So it doesn't really matter that much anyway, right? Well, it does matter because if we swing at their face, it requires a 2k. And I don't know if you know this, but in One Piece decks, people have a lot more 1ks than they have 2ks. So every time we get a 2k out of their hand, it's really, really good for us because that's 1 2k that further down the line, they cannot defend their life with. What's interesting about this scenario is that if you zoom out and take a look at what the actual material impact of this play was, we realize that by swinging at their face with 6k, we force a 2k out of their hand. Whereas if we swing at their Weevil, we only force a 1k out of hand. They want to protect both of them kind of equally, but because one had way more power, they were incentivized to counter out with a more potent counter card. When we understand this, it makes the game a lot easier to play because we realize that we can put a lot of pressure on the opponent. We know what their incentive is in any given moment in the game, and we can force them into the highest pressure situation that we possibly can. Anyway, thanks so much for watching. Hope you learned something from this video, and I hope you stay tuned for future episodes of this series. I will be going over a bunch of topics, but yeah, let me know if you have any topics that you can think of that you'd like me to talk about, and I will discuss them in future episodes. It's your boy real_Joshua. Find me on Twitter at HiThereJosh. Check out my streams at real_Joshua on twitch.tv, and I will see you in the next one. Later.